Hi there, my name is Luis Carlos Ferraz Manini. I'm a master's student at Universidade Estadual de Londrina in the state of Paraná, Brazil. This presentation will discuss about the role of media in the deconstruction of Portuguese empire in America, specifically discussing the performance of a Brazilian journalist of the early 19th century called Cipriano Barata. In order to explain what I'm gonna do, in some parts I will be reading this text, some other parts I will be explaining this to you. So let's start with some informations that are quite important to build the ground where we can start from. So the emergence of the printing press in the 15th century may be pointed to one of the factors that contributed to the passage from the Middle Ages to the modern world, since its use has stimulated many changes in this period. Benedict Anderson calls this phenomenon the establishment of the print capitalism, which must be understood not only from an economic perspective, but also in its cultural dimension, since this event has influenced many other changes, as the Protestant Reformation. In Brazil, that is our case specifically, the emergence of the printing press was a late phenomenon, as shown by all the authors who have devoted themselves to this study. Born in the 19th century, the press was responsible for the creation of the public opinion, which can be considered as its main contribution because it brought to the public discussions, some issues that were restricted to the private sphere. In that context, some characters stood out by the influence that they reached by disseminating their ideas. Among them, we point Cipriano Barata. He was born in the state of Bahia in 1762 or 1763, since we had two documents that shows his birth. And he was a son of middle-class white parents. And in the most of the Brazilian history, it was quite difficult to be in the middle class, since in one hand we had the large landowners, and in the other hand we have the biggest part of the population that were the slaves. So the middle class did not have many options to change their situation. One possibility was to send their sons to study in Europe, particularly in French universities and especially in Portuguese institutions. That was the fate of Cipriano Barata, who studied at the University of Coimbra in the late 18th century. And for the objective of this work, of this discussion, thinking about the 18th century is quite important. Why? During this period, it spread through Europe the set of ideas known as the Enlightenment. This movement had in France its main center of production of ideas, and this had spread through Europe and then came to the colonies. This diffusion was characterized by differentiated appropriations in each place, serving for many particular uses. So when we think about Enlightenment, we must make a difference between what happened in France, what was thought about it in England and Portugal and Brazil and the other colonies where these ideas came to. In the Portuguese case, its reception featured an interpretation that created the idea of enlightened despotism. Through the action of the Marquis of Pombal during the reign of Joseph I, or in Portuguese how we call José I, the ideas of the Enlightenment were the basis for a major renovation, which aimed to stimulate trade and science, while it strengthened the power of the king in a conception of politics which became known as civil empire. So this point in particular is absolutely important. because we can understand how these ideas were used in this particular context. So, this conception was present at the reform undertaken by the Portuguese government at the University of Coimbra and served as the basis for the studies that were developed there. We can say that in his studies, Cipriano Barata came into contact with such ideas, but they did not arrive unchanged when he returned to Brazil. We think that the understanding that Brazilian students have about these ideas, which they came into contact, also went through another filter: their colonial origin, and thus the appropriation of the concept was subjected to a new interpretation. So, every time we say about this, let's talk this again, the Enlightenment ideas are going to be changed in each different place it was known. Barata returned to Brazil in 1790s, and sometime later he was accused of being a leader of the emancipationist movement known as Bahia Conjuration, or in his original name, Conjuração Baiana, in 1798. This conspiracy has been following some basic guidelines already launched by another movement which occurred in 1789 at Minas Gerais, which also craved freedom to Brazil from Portugal. Acquitted and released in 1800, Cipriano Barata reappeared on the public scene in 1821, when he was chosen as a deputy to the Cortes that formed in Portugal after the Liberal Revolution of 1820. His participation in this event can be characterized as turbulent, as it came into friction with some Portuguese deputies, since those men did not wish to await the arrival of all Brazilian deputies to begin the discussions. At this point, it's interesting to note one of the main issues that hit Brazil shortly after its independence. Arriving in Portugal, Cipriano Barata speaks from the interests of their state, or even his homeland, as he called it. Later, due to a dispute with the Portuguese representatives, he will talk about a Brazilian cause, showing how this national consciousness was not yet formed and how the issue of territory was not yet seen as a unit. So it will appears so many times in his newspaper, this question about what is a nation and the difference between these and the conception of homeland, as he calls. So this is another point, but we don't have enough time to discuss this at this presentation. Upon returning to Brazil at the end of 1822, Cipriano could not land in his state because there was a war occurring between its inhabitants and the Portuguese troops in the independence conflicts contest. Because of this, he settled in the state of Pernambuco, where he founded his newspaper called the Sentinel of Liberty, or in Portuguese, Sentinela da Liberdade, already in 1823. This was one of the many newspapers that appeared in Brazil after the end of the censorship decreed by the king in 1821. Since then, many characters came to devote themselves to the public discussion about the future of the country. As stated by the historian Isabel Lustosa, the press was a laboratory in which the political struggles were developed, in a time of experimentation of this new type of discussion, hitherto restricted to the private sphere. Such was the importance acquired by the press that the same historian also said that the press not talked about facts, but it did create the facts. So we can quote two examples of this statement. The first one is about a particular date called in Portuguese Dia do Fico, and we could say that in English like the day of staying, and it is the time when Pedro I decides to stay in Brazil. So it was created through the press. The other example was the convening of the Constituent Assembly in June of the same year. So all these events were first discussed in the newspapers, and then it became a reality in Brazil. So the press was not just talking about the facts, discussing the facts, but it helped to create these facts.